Hello and welcome to another video review. This is King Arthur, the role-playing wargame for PC. This is an interesting game developed by NeoCore and published by Paradox Interactive in 2009. It is a PC exclusive. It's kind of a weird genre because it does bill itself as the role-playing wargame. The simplest explanation I can think of it's the Total War style of grand strategy mixed together with a fantasy setting with magic and all this, and role-playing game elements. And I'll get to that when I get to the gameplay, but that makes for an interesting title, and so naturally I just had to check this out. Now the presentation's pretty surprising for an indie game. It actually looks pretty good. It looks about on par with Medieval 2 Total War, and that game looks absolutely phenomenal, of course. Even today it still looks great. So to say that King Arthur looks a lot like that is not a bad thing. I actually kind of dig the art style too. It's this medieval fantasy that's somewhat steeped in Arthurian mythos, but it's a really interesting take on it. And they got really creative with just the general style of these characters and how everything looks. It doesn't look anything like the actual stuff would at the time when the Arthurian legend actually does take place. But it is still a very cool idea, and it does actually lend to a very nice, fantastical, mystical setting, and it really does help to draw you in. The visuals themselves, I mean, textures, shaders, all of that, great. I do have a slight gripe about the animations, though. They do look a little bit clumsy. They look a little jagged, and that's to kind of be expected. I mean, it is an indie game. It's not like these people are professional animators or anything. I mean, they may well be, of course, but it does give that kind of unprofessional, unmocapped vibe with the animations. And while it isn't a big complaint, it is just a little bit of a minor gripe for me. And then you have the sound design. Music is surprisingly well done. I mean, it's pretty minimal. There aren't that many tracks in this game. But it does have that very mystical fantasy vibe to it, and I really do like it. It's very pleasing to the ears. The only problem I had with it was it did tend to repeat quite a lot. And eventually I did get kind of tired of it, but it was no big deal. I kind of strove through it. And eventually just kind of ignored how it was kind of looping over and over again at some point. Then you have the sound effects themselves, which are pretty average. I mean, it's your standard sword clangs, all that kind of stuff. Nothing sounds particularly out of place. Nothing sounds particularly noteworthy. It just does its job very well, and that's exactly what it's supposed to do. And the voice acting is the narrator's not bad. He does kind of go a little bit overboard sometimes, but it's no big deal. But the characters themselves, it's extremely basic voice acting, and it does its job, but the problem is it's really not that noticeable. You don't really care about it because it's just your standard confirmation notices and such like that. I mean, like you click on, say, some footmen, and they sit there, infantry, and then you tell them to attack, and they're like, yes sir, or whatever they actually say. And so it's pretty simplistic in that regard, and for that, it doesn't do a bad job. But it would have been nice if they had spruced up the voice acting a little bit. So then we come to the story and the gameplay. Now, the story, like it should be, considering the title of the game, is heavily based on the Arthurian legend, the Arthurian mythos, as I like to call it. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And so basically you play as King Arthur. You are the Grand High Commander of your forces. King Arthur is not actually a unit in the game. He's just kind of the figurehead that you play as, and you're kind of like the god character almost. And so you make all the decisions for where you're going to send your units, what upgrades you're going to make, all that kind of stuff. That's what King Arthur does. And you basically are trying to unite all of Britannia, which is Great Britain, for those of you who don't know what that is, and that'd be kind of embarrassing. But you're trying to unite Britannia under your banner. And this is where a lot of problems come in, because you have to find ways to deal with the Christians who are fighting the Old Faith people. Basically, the Old Faith is the druids and the fairies. You do get fantastical creatures if you go for the Old Faith route. But for some reason, I actually feel like they've made the Christian units way more powerful, individually anyway. Because the Old Faith units, you don't get a lot of them. And if you do get them, they're ungodly expensive. Now, with the Christians, you get a fair amount of troops, and they're pretty powerful to boot. They're kind of expensive too, but still, it seems pretty unbalanced to me in that regard. But I did go the Old Faith route in this game, and I did find that the Christians were kind of overpowered. So if you want to basically break your game, then go for the Christians. But basically the Christians are trying to eradicate the Old Faith, and the Old Faith is trying to survive, and this means that they do have to fight off the Christians, or at least find ways to live with them peacefully. And this is also where the Rightful versus Tyrant comes in. Rightful is basically you go for the noble route, you go for the lawmaker route, where it's justice for all, and you try to do the right thing instead of just the quick and easy path as Vader did. And what I'd say there is the Tyrant path. It's basically the win at all costs, the suppress the populace instead of grant them freedoms or whatever. It's basically the rule with an iron fist route. Now, don't get me wrong, you can rule with an iron fist as Rightful too, but it's a different kind. And depending on which route you go there, you'll also get different units, even if you go for the other faiths. Say, for instance, you go the Old Faith route. If you go the Tyrant route, you will get the Unseelie. Whereas if you go the Rightful route with the Old Faith, you will get the Seelie. So that's just one of the things that they do. They also give you different bonuses, different abilities that you can allot to your Knights of the Round Table. And these all play into different things. It's a lot of bonuses and such to production and such like that, depending on which route you take. And so the morality system is pretty central to the game, and a lot of the adventures that you go on will actually be dictated by that. And that brings me to the adventures. This is where the role-playing stuff comes in. You have 12 Knights of the Round Table, up to 12 anyway. And basically, these are your heroes, your generals. They have their own stats, they have their own abilities, they have basically they can cast spells and such like that, depending on, of course, what you're going with. And you send them on adventures. These are quests where you will find different bits of storyline, and this is basically where the storyline is played out. It's in these adventures. And you'll also get random quests along the way to get different things, like trade quests, or you might just have to fight something off, or you might be able to rescue a maiden, or something like that. All sorts of random quests are generated quite often, so you never really run out of these, even if you do run out of them in the storyline. But the story unfolds through these adventures. They're basically choose your own adventure. You basically tell them what you want to do. It's basically kind of like an A, B, C thing. And different outcomes can be influenced by your morality, by your character's morality, by your character's stats. If you're not up to the task, then, well, you're kind of screwed. And what this ends up doing is creating this interesting feel with the game. It doesn't necessarily feel like a strategy game, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, because the strategy elements are kind of a mess, to be honest with you. You do have tactical combat like in Total War. It's basically Total War with magic and role-playing elements. You have the overland map of Britannia, which it contains all of the the counties that you will go along, like, say, Suffolk or Wessex or stuff like that. And you're trying to conquer all of these, or bring them under your dominion, and so that's where you do all your overland stuff. That's where you go find the adventures and that sort of thing. You also have the tactical combat, which is basically like Total War. It's you command your forces against the others. You have victory points that you can capture that will lower the enemy's morale until eventually you win. That is, if you have the majority of them. And this can be kind of problematic. If you don't get to the victory points fast enough, you will lose. It doesn't matter how many of the enemy you eradicate. I actually fought off this massive horde of enemies. I was pretty much sure I was going to lose to begin with. But I went to fight them, and I got them down to 5 archers. Literally 5 archers in one unit. That was the only thing they had left, and I still lost despite having about 200 or 300 units left. It was ridiculous. And that was because they had controlled the victory points. So word of warning there. Go to the victory points as soon as you can. This is where your heroes can also use their abilities, like their combat special moves and such. And to be honest with you, I never really felt like the heroes had a huge impact on the battles until later on, because their abilities are pretty weak until you get them up to pretty high levels, which is around 15 to 20. By the end of the game, you'll probably have a lot of heroes around level 22 or 3, something like that. Maybe more or less, it depends on how you play it. But I kind of felt like the armies themselves were just really unbalanced. Not only the Christian versus Old Faith thing, but for some reason it seems like you will always lose a lot of troops, and you don't really know why. You can send in better troops against weaker troops, and somehow your better troops will lose. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I don't really know how they calculate all this. I mean, like for Total War, I do know kind of how they calculate things. I do know how it's trying to be realistic. This isn't trying to be realistic, and that presents a kind of a problem, because then you kind of have no idea what's going on. It becomes more of a game of numbers than anything else, and that kind of bothered me. Still, if you know what you're doing, you can still win most of your battles. The problem I also had was that I had to use cheats to actually beat this game, because there was a certain point in the game where I couldn't progress any further unless I cheated, just because it was that brutally difficult. So, I mean, this is just me, and I mean, I'll admit to it. I did have to cheat to beat this game. That's not, I don't really feel bothered by that, but I did try to play it legit as much as possible, and eventually I just couldn't. So, fair warning to you, if you don't really put a lot of effort into this game, you'll probably find it really frustrating. But that said, it's not a terrible game by any means. I mean, it's certainly got a lot of problems. I ended up running into a lot of rebellions late in the game, and that was really problematic, even with cheats. But ultimately, one of the biggest problems is its lack of a diplomacy feature, too. I really hated that. It didn't really feel right. So, if you're looking for an interesting take on the strategy genre, this is a pretty good one to pick up, but I wouldn't recommend picking it up for full price. I mean, even full price is pretty cheap, but still. Make sure you also get it with the expansions, because they certainly fix a few of the issues. Still, overall, it's not bad. It's a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.